The tug of war over language is again pulling in two different directions in Canada. Who will win? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. We're coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. The federal government, and in particular the Prime Minister, has said he's concerned about the decline in the use of French in Quebec. Whether it is or isn't is up for debate. While it may appear there are fewer French-speaking people in Quebec, the same holds true for English. A Journal de Montreal column claimed that there was a decline in French being offered by retailers in downtown Montreal. That's what sparked all this. It was a little too anecdotal, as the writer only visited 30 stores in Montreal. Half offered services in English. Not exactly scientific nor worthy of the alarmist headlines that came with it. Anytime language becomes an issue in this country, the rhetoric ramps up. At issue this time, the province of Quebec wants Bill 101, the province's language law, to apply to federally regulated businesses in Quebec, which is a federal jurisdiction. You can weigh in with our unpublished.vote question. Do you feel the French language is on the decline in Quebec? Yes, no, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. Now, coming up on Unpublished Cafe, we'll take a look at the new legislation and hear why it may or may not be useful. Montreal area MP and Minister of Official Languages, Melanie Joly, has revealed the details. She was invited to join us, but was unable. Coming up on the show, we'll chat with Jean Johnson, president of the Fédération des communautés francophones et acadiennes du Canada. As well, Christian Bork, Executive Vice President, Leger 360. He'll join us. And first, I am pleased to be joined by Kevin Shar. He is the Vice President of Quebec Community Groups Network. And Kevin, did your group feel this legislation needed to be modernized?
Well, we've been participating in the modernization of the Official Languages Act since 2018. We submitted a brief along with other groups. It was time to modernize the act, the Official Languages Act. The last time this was done was in 1988. And the QCGN, along with the FCFA and several other groups, made recommendations, and some of those recommendations have appeared in Melanie Joly's discussion paper.
And in terms of it being modernized, what needed to be modernized in the legislation?
Well, I think there's a few things, but what we've seen, of course, is the technological revolution that's occurred since 1988. Whether or not this addresses that is something else, but there are definitely some measures in there to address the rise of English in the digital world as the language of work, or international language of work. There's a few things that are mostly bureaucratic in nature, but are certainly useful for the enforcement of the existing act itself. Whether it's the centralization of oversight to Treasury Board, I think that's a positive thing. They've eliminated the exception that existed for bilingual judges at the Supreme Court level. There's more measures for institutional support in the community, where the federal government is recognizing that a lot of the difficulties faced by minority language communities is at the provincial level. So this is a way of funneling the federal spending power into those provincial jurisdictions, which of course creates some certain difficulties in Quebec. But I think those are all positive things, but what's really of concern to the English community is the language of work in federally regulated enterprises.
And in that case, what is the concern of your organization?
Well, the federal government has decided to, I think the first time in history, has decided to regulate or legislate rather in favor of one language, and that's the French language. And in Quebec, that's the majority language. So, as a minority language community, that creates some very serious concerns for us. We are underrepresented, or actually not represented at all, one could say, at the provincial public service. We're less than 1%. That's the largest employer in the province. They're the bureaucrats making decisions that affect our communities, that affect our institutions, and our voice isn't heard. We are underrepresented in federal institutions outside the national capital region. Largest employer in the country. Again, same problem there. We have higher rates of unemployment than the Francophone majority. We have that multiplies when you look at youth unemployment. There's a youth retention problem in our community. We have a larger percentage of English-speaking Quebecers below the poverty line when compared with the Francophone majority. So, I mean, all of these higher rates of poverty in the English-speaking compared to the Francophone majority. So all of these, I mean, once you start legislating in favor of one language as opposed to another, and I mean, I think it's important to state here that there's nothing demonstrating that these companies aren't perfectly able to operate in French, and that the people aren't able to work in French in these companies, or that these companies aren't delivering services in French. There's absolutely no suggestion of that. But when you start legislating in favor of one language, in this case in Quebec, the majority language, then our concern is that this is going to create a chilling effect for our employability and our ability to retain our youth.
Kevin Char joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. He's the Vice President of Quebec Community Groups Network as we discuss language laws in Canada as the federal government plans on modernizing the Official Languages Act. And when you talk about those kind of numbers, and those are pretty drastic numbers when you talk about the English-speaking employment within the provincial civil service and federal civil service in Quebec, is there any political support behind you and your organization to let people know that you're kind of feeling left out here?
Well, I mean, there's certainly dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, we don't have the political weight, I think, to necessarily bring these things. I mean, we have the ability to talk to our members of parliament, and certainly as an organization, we've been in touch with the various actors in this case. But this change is coming from a political imperative.
Mm.
And like I said, there's very little factual evidence to demonstrate what we call in legislative terms the social ill that needs to be addressed, right? So it's a political imperative. And the dangers when you act on a political imperative, and this is coming from the minority status of the government, this is coming from pressure from the Bloc Québécois, conservative support for Bloc Québécois measure, a silent NDP. So when you add this all up, when you're legislating on the basis of a political imperative as opposed to something that needs to be addressed, then there's always a risk that minority community like ours will be left in the dark or in the dust.
Now, Melanie Joly has said publicly that she understands that there would be a lot of anxiety among the English-speaking minority in Quebec and Montreal, and said that no jobs would be lost by any of those people. Does that have any reassurance for you?
Well, I don't know how you could say that. I mean, there's, we face a similar difficulty at the provincial level. We're a very bilingual population, right? One of the most bilingual cohorts in the country, and I think my identity, as well as members of my community, is very in favor of that bilingualism, or feels that way, I should say. But and we don't see that at the provincial level, which has a policy towards one language. So we see it at the federal level, and now the federal government seems to be moving away from that, which is concerning. Now, about losing jobs, I mean, like I said, we're the largest employer in the province. We're not existent. We're underrepresented, the largest employer in the country. You can say, I mean, I think that the plan is to, from what I read in Joly's proposal, was to include a provision saying, well, this shouldn't affect the ability to use English, but it's not guaranteeing a right to use English.
Right.
So we're filling a void that exists because there is no regulation in private enterprise for language, but we're filling a void with rights in favor of one group.
Kevin, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Kevin Shar is the vice president of Quebec Community Groups Network, as well as a constitutional lawyer. And I'll be honest, every time I hear language is becoming an issue in this country, I cynically think it's trying to distract from something else. To get some more perspective on the state of the French language in Quebec, I'm pleased to be joined by Christian Bourque. He's executive vice president of Léger 360. And Christian, is French on the decline in Quebec?
It depends on how you look at it. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about usage of the French language, mostly on the island of Montreal, because that's where most of the immigration coming into Quebec actually will settle. Most tend to agree that there is a slight decline in people who claim that French is the main language they use every day. However, does that mean that the French language is threatened in any way? Or beyond the numbers, this gets political very, very quickly. So it's hard to actually get sort of or look at the data very objectively when it comes to usage of the French language, because as soon as you mention French language, then people on all the political sides try to jump on that issue to make it their own.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's probably more important today than it was maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Back then, people wanted, or some parties wanted to talk about independence, Quebec independence, or separatism, or call it what you want. And then people on the other side would actually want to actually talk about the threat of independence as the main motivator to vote one way or the other in a provincial or federal election. Today, that's not the axis on which Quebec politics is defined anymore. We've sort of moved away from yes or no to a referendum to sort of more of a left-right let's say, perspective on politics, which is the rest of the world basically operates on that one. And so as we're switching over, and that the potential for independence to be a vote gatherer is slowly disappearing or dissipating, much of the sort of nationalist parties, the Parti Québécois, and now the CAQ in particular, who's forming government in Quebec, says, well, if it's not independence anymore, what's left if I want to appeal to nationalist voters? Language comes next. And if you look at all the surveys we've done on the French language over the past few years, those who feel that French tends to be most threatened are people over the age of 55 that tend not to live in Montreal. And guess what? Almost all of the ridings that the CAQ won were outside the island of Montreal, and mostly getting their majorities from voters who are over the age of 55. So it's still fairly much that baby boom generation that was very close to the sovereignty movement back then, that is still very sort of hyped up on the French language issue at the moment in Quebec. But still, even though as millennials form that sort of a huge chunk of voters in the younger age cohorts, we know people over 55 will go out and vote, they participate, and they still make up a powerful force in politics.
What, in terms of the French language in Quebec, what's the impact been of digital technology and immigration?
Well, and they're different. A lot of older Quebecers tend to believe that social media is sort of an enemy of the survival of the French language, because it tends to include more English than they would like, and it tends to make, or they feel it makes, younger generations more sort of global generations as opposed to local generation. Their focus is somewhere else. It's on global warming, it's on other issues outside of this whole French English debate, which used to dictate politics in the province. So again, they view that as sort of an element of threat to the French language. I think the issue of immigration is a bit different. Still, the sort of survival instinct, or la survivance as we used to call it, is still a motivator in politics. And some of the younger voters are feeling that more immigration equals less presence of the French language in the province. So that is fairly still sort of present. However, to the extent that this would actually get people to vote one way or the other, I think is still up for debate, and even more so in a federal election compared to a provincial election. if you look at the last federal election, if the Bloc Québécois sort of came back as a political force, it was not because necessarily that all of a sudden French was becoming this huge element of debate. It was because failure of the Conservatives to present the candidate that was presentable to the Québécois audience, but that's about it. I do feel, though, that there still is an element, even though language politics is not the defining thing we're seeing now, the element in what the federal government is actually proposing, there is in there some form of reconciliation, if I can call it that, that could make it, to some extent, a political winner. Of course, it'll draw a lot of criticism from some of the pundits here in the province, but if it goes through, I think for some voters sort of at the margins, it probably will have a fairly positive effect on keeping, again, that threat of separatism at bay.
And that's basically, as I mentioned off the top, every time I hear language is brought up in this country, I get a little cynical, and maybe that's just because I've been around for a while and I've seen it. Do you think right now that there's enough safeguards for the French language in Quebec, or does this legislation really need to be modernized and updated?
I believe so, and a lot of people who, and that includes people at the Liberal Party here in Quebec, are saying that, you know what, after 40 years, I might not have liked everything about Bill 101, but it has had a positive impact on protecting the French language in Quebec. So there is a bit of a consensus that some of the basic safeguards are actually indeed already in place in the province. And now the willingness to go much further will, of course, depend on how people feel that language will be high or low on the agenda coming the next provincial and federal election, for that matter. But there are some issues that people feel very strongly about, but yet have no impact on vote. And I believe, to some extent, language probably will tend to be one of them. I think the CAQ, in sort of making language a central part of their platform, is trying to win that issue away from the Parti Québécois in order to get more support. But that's about it. I don't think language is redefining right now in the short term how people will vote in the next election. I don't think it has that power. It's not the environment, it's not education, it's not healthcare, it's not public finances. And very quickly, you'll see that it falls out of the top 8 or 10 major issues in Quebec.
It's more shock than awe.
Absolutely. I just remember the niqab thing in the 2015 federal election. It did not change the vote of more than a handful of Canadians. Although everybody was talking about it, it did not have an impact on the vote.
Interesting. Christian, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Christian Bourque is the Executive Vice President of Leger 360. It has been decades since the Official Languages Act has been updated, and one group happy about that is the Fédération de Communautés Francophones et Acadiennes du Canada. Jean Janssen is the president, and he joins us now. And Jean, what makes you feel French is on the decline in Quebec, if it is on the decline?
Well, actually, from a Western Canadian, Franco-Canadian who goes to Montreal, for example, for me, it becomes evident very, very, very rapidly. I find a lot of people addressing me in English with a really heavy French accent. And when I respond to them in French, it takes them 2 or 3 exchanges before they realize that I'm talking to them in their first language. So I see that there's a change, there's an evolution. We see the number of students that register in the English programs, and I fully understand why they would want to do that. So we see an erosion there. We intuitively, or for me as a Franco-Albertan, am somewhat preoccupied with what's going on in Quebec. And because what's going on in Quebec is also a reflection of the erosion that's going on throughout our communities across Canada.
Your group says the act is woefully outdated. What makes it so?
Well, it was presented in 1969, and it was revised and reimagined under Brian Mulroney's leadership in 1988. and virtually there was just a small modification done in 2004, which was positive measures in Article 7 of the Act, but nothing else has been done. And in the current bill that we have now, we have words like may as opposed to shall, and it changes the tone of a bill. So right now, it really doesn't have the power to be to impose any kind of respect.
The FCFA says there are structural flaws in in legislation. What are those flaws?
Number one is that nobody assumes responsibility for the bill. Nobody has unique responsibility. We pass the responsibility on to an existing minister. So right now, Minister Joly basically has a responsibility of the Official Language Act, which should mean that she should impose to her colleagues, but it's really a peer-to-peer relationship. And it really needs to be a central agency like the Treasury Council, who has the responsibility of oversight on the bill, its implementation, and the obligations to respect that bill. It should go to a central agency as opposed to a minister to a minister.
Now, in terms of the French language right now, what in your perspective is making it vulnerable?
I think if we look at what's going on just in the post-secondary sector right now across Canada, you have Campus Saint-Jean, which is a very fragile institution within the University of Alberta that provides a lot of value in our society right now in terms of training teachers for the immersion programs and the Francophone schools. Right now across Canada, there's over 2,500 teachers that we're looking for the Francophone, and there's over 20,000 teachers that we're looking for the immersion programs. And those institutions are key. Saint Boniface or Laurentian University, we heard an awful lot about it. We heard about the University Franco-Ontarienne in Toronto. Those institutions are really fragile right now. And to build the strength of our communities, you need to reinforce the institutions that we have. Otherwise, we're relegated to a slow and painful death.
What makes those organizations fragile?
I think a lot of it underfunding. The other one is oversight control. For example, Campus Saint-Jean really is a campus within the University of Alberta. So they are subjected to to the administration's will and whim. And right now, Campus Saint-Jean would be better with a federated university model within the University of Alberta, much as we see the University of Toronto has, I believe, 3 federated universities within the U of T. Those are excellent models, and what it does is provide administrative independence and a joint academic responsibility. So you protect the integrity of the academic programs, but you provide an ability and flexibility to be able to directly negotiate your agreements with the provincial and federal governments.
Now, when I looked over your website, the aim for FCFA, a bilingual workforce coast to coast. How will that happen?
Well, I think if we're going to set a goal, we might as well set a big, large, audacious goal. And that is the vision of Canada that we've been talking about for over 50 years, a bilingual Canada. We listen to our federal government talking about that. One of the things that I think we need to do is build that equality between the 2 languages, and use those strategies as an economic strategy nationally and worldwide. On the world stage, if we are stronger in terms of both of our languages, both and both of our linguistic communities thrive, and nationally and internationally. So I think the French language should become a cornerstone of an economic strategy for our country.
You know, yeah, you brought up fair and equal, and in terms of in the province of Quebec with this legislation, you're looking at English speakers who make up probably less than 10% of the population, but they have 0 jobs in the Quebec provincial government, and drastically underrepresented in the federal government. So how do we get that to fair? Obviously, if between the English speaking and the French speaking, how do you get that to fair?
Well, I think one of the things that I've heard an awful lot from the leadership of the Anglophone communities, because we are in ongoing contact with them, and we agree that there are points of divergence in terms of our strategic positioning. But I also understand that the Anglo community in Quebec has to protect their own institutions. That I stand by 100%. But one of the things that I've been told by the leadership of QCGN is that our language is really not at risk of disappearing. So we're not really threatened by an element that I have to work with on a daily basis. Is how do we ensure the survival of the French language across Canada? That's not the case for the English language. That doesn't mean that there are not challenges for the Anglo community in Quebec. And I think right now I see that they're doing a lot of workshops, a lot of on-site, online dialogues and conversations with their community to talk about how to build a stronger argument and positions towards Bill 101, which is really coming down the track here at a rapid rate. And the Official Languages Act, what does it mean in terms of asymmetry? We've always said that to work with Canada's two official languages, we need a differentiated approach as opposed to a mirror approach. And the mirror approach basically is to mirror my community, our Francophone and Acadian communities across Canada, with the dominant Anglophone community, and that's not a fair comparison. And to say that we're going to do everything the same for everybody, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked for 50 years, and it has to change. So for us is to do that delicate dance with the Anglo community in Quebec without offending them and hindering the work that they're doing, all the while representing the interests of French outside of Quebec.
Jean, I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, James. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you on this today.
Jean Johnson is the president of the Fédération des Communautés Francophones et Acadiennes du Canada. And that leads to our unpublished vote question. Do you feel the use of the French language is on the decline in Quebec? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. I want to thank our guests, Kevin Shar, Vice President, Quebec Community Groups Network, as well. Christian Bork, he's the Executive Vice President of Léger 360, as well as Jean Johnson, President of the FCFA. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.